Betrayed by love, the heartbreaking dinner that changed everything. It was supposed to be a night of normalcy. A rare chance for my family to forget the harsh realities we were all facing, especially my sister, Emily. She'd been battling stage 4 cancer for 2 years, and there had barely been a moment of peace for any of us. But tonight felt different. Emily had been feeling better than usual and asked if we could all gather for dinner. It wasn't just any dinner, it was a celebration of her strength, a brief respite from the hospitals and treatments that had consumed her life. I invited Sara, my girlfriend of 2 years, to join us. After all, she'd met my family countless times before. They'd always been polite to her, even if my mom had occasionally mentioned how Sara could be a bit direct. But tonight, I hoped things would be different. I wanted Sara to see Emily in a moment of joy, to see the lightness in her laugh, to understand what family really meant to me. The evening started off better than I could have hoped. Emily was in high spirits, making jokes and laughing, her usual brightness filling the room. I watched her closely, taking in every second, grateful for the rare glimpse of normality. Sara seemed, well, off. She was quiet, distant, barely touching her wine. Every now and then, I caught her glancing down at her phone under the table, a small frown playing on her lips. I couldn't quite place it, but something wasn't right. I figured she might just be tired, maybe stressed about something I didn't know. But I never could have imagined how things would shift when the conversation turned to Emily's treatment. My dad, ever the optimist, had been talking about a new clinical trial we were hoping to get Emily into. It was expensive, extremely expensive, but if there was even a sliver of hope, we were willing to take it. We'd spent so much already, but when it came to family, it never felt like enough. You did what you had to do. But then, without warning, Sara spoke up, her voice cutting through the conversation like a knife. I mean, at what point do you just stop? She said, casually setting her fork down on the plate. You're throwing money into a black hole. The room fell into an eerie silence. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. Did she just say that? The air felt thick. My mom's face turned pale, and I could see Emily try to laugh it off, her voice cracking midway through the sentence, trying to disguise the hurt with a shaky smile. But Sara didn't stop. I'm just saying, she continued, her tone dripping with indifference, sometimes you have to be realistic. You could put all that money into treatments and trials, but let's face it, it's not going to change the outcome. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. My heart dropped, and I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, my face flushing hot. I wanted to scream at her, to demand that she leave right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. Not in front of Emily. Instead, I stared at Sara, hoping, praying that she'd somehow realize how far out of line she was and apologize. But no apology came. She just sat there, sipping her wine like she hadn't just shattered the mood, like she hadn't just ripped through my family's moment of peace with those words. And that's when I knew something had changed. Something deep inside me snapped. The evening, which had started with such promise, began to unravel quickly. I could feel the tension creeping in, the air growing thick and suffocating. Every time I glanced at Sara, I noticed how much more distant she seemed. She barely touched her food, and the way she stared at her phone, her eyes flicking nervously, only added to the unease in my chest. It was as if she wasn't even trying to engage with my family anymore. She was already mentally checked out. But she didn't stop there. The conversation had shifted back to Emily's treatment. My dad was talking about the expenses involved, the trials, the hope we had for her future. It wasn't easy, but it was something we were willing to fight for. It was all we could do. But Sara just leaned back in her chair, took another sip of her wine, and then the words came out again, casual, as if they were no big deal. Seriously, you guys, she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. You're throwing money into something that's never going to work. She's not going to get better. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the first time she'd expressed such a cold, detached opinion, but it was the first time I'd felt it so deeply. I wanted to shout, to call her out for being so heartless, but I bit my tongue. Not here. Not now. Not with Emily sitting at the table, her face already turning pale as she tried to mask her discomfort. I watched her closely, her eyes shifting uncomfortably. There was a silence at the table, broken only by Sara's unflinching tone. I mean, come on, she added, how much longer are you going to do this? It's not like it's going to change anything. My blood was boiling, but I kept my voice steady. I couldn't let it all explode in front of Emily. I needed to stay calm to protect her. But each word that came out of Sara's mouth felt like a blade, cutting deeper than the last. How could she be so dismissive? So cold? The more she spoke, the more I started to notice the cracks that had always been there in our relationship. The way she looked down on people, how she thought everyone else's problems were just inconveniences. The way she belittled others for showing empathy, calling them naive or overly emotional. The worst part? How she could sit there, so unaffected by my sister's pain, and casually dismiss it as if it didn't matter. My mind raced. How had I missed this? Was I really so blind to what she was? I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation. But instead, I just stared at her, my hands gripping the edge of the table, my nails digging into the wood. What's wrong with you? I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky but firm. Sara didn't even flinch. She leaned back in her chair, her posture as casual as ever. I'm just being practical, she said, as if the answer was obvious, as if she had no idea how much those words were hurting me, how they were tearing everything apart. Practical? The word hit me like a slap to the face. How could she be so indifferent? So detached? In that moment, everything about her, the sarcasm, the dismissive attitude, the way she just couldn't understand the value of family felt so alien to me. I had been willing to overlook so many of her flaws, but this was different. This wasn't just a flaw. This was a fundamental disconnect. I looked at her, my heart pounding, the weight of my sister's pain settling in my chest. You don't get it, do you? I whispered, but I could feel the distance between us growing wider with each passing second. Sara just shrugged, completely unfazed. And in that moment, I realized there was no turning back. There was no reconciling this. I had to choose. Emily stood up abruptly, her face pale, and quietly excused herself from the table. The room felt like it was closing in, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I could escape with her, away from the suffocating weight of what was happening. But I knew I couldn't. Not now. I didn't say anything as Emily walked out, her footsteps faint against the floor. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the way she forced a smile, but there was no hiding the pain. As soon as the door closed behind her, I turned to Sara, my voice low but filled with a quiet fury that had been building all night. What the hell is wrong with you? I demanded, my fists clenched so tightly I could feel my nails digging into my palms. My voice trembled, but I couldn't hold it back anymore. Do you even hear yourself? Do you have any idea how far out of line you've gone? Sara barely looked up from her phone. She had barely reacted when Emily left, and now her indifference was like a slap in the face. What? She asked, without missing a beat. I was just being honest. Honest? I scoffed. You're not being honest, Sara. You're being cruel. You're not just criticizing her treatment, you're tearing apart everything I believe in. You're making it sound like my sister is some project. Like she's just something to fix or throw away when it gets too hard. Her expression remained unchanged. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't seem to care about the raw emotion spilling from me. Instead, she shrugged like I was the one who was overreacting. Someone has to be realistic, Ethan. You can't just throw money at something that isn't going to change the outcome. I felt my breath catch, the weight of her words pressing down harder than I'd anticipated. She wasn't just dismissing the treatment, she was dismissing Emily's life. Everything we were fighting for, every moment that had been spent in pain and hope was suddenly irrelevant to her. She didn't see my sister as a person, as a daughter, as family. She saw numbers, costs, statistics. Stop, I said, my voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. You don't get it. She's not just a project. She's my sister. My family. And this isn't about money or practicality. This is about love, Sara. It's about standing by the people you care about, no matter how hard it gets. Sara's eyes finally met mine, but there was no softness, no understanding, just a coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. You're just too emotional about this, Ethan, she said, her tone flat, dismissive. You're making everything so dramatic. It's just reality. Someone has to see it. Reality? In that moment, it felt like a light bulb flickered on inside me. I'd been ignoring so many things, so many signs, because I wanted to believe in something that was never real. The truth was, Sara had never been capable of seeing the world the way I did. She couldn't see the value in love, in sacrifice, in fighting for the ones you love even when there was no guarantee of success. You're right, I said, my voice barely above a whisper now, a quiet finality settling over me. I am too emotional. And you're too cold. You don't care. You don't care about my sister. You don't care about me. And you never will. Her face twisted into a look of mild confusion, like she didn't understand what I was talking about. But I was done. The disconnect was too vast. The rift between us too wide. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. This is over, Sara, I said firmly. I can't be with someone who doesn't understand what family means. Not anymore. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt clear-headed. The anger, the disbelief, it all gave way to a sense of relief, as if I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even know I had. I had just made the hardest decision of my life, but somehow in that moment it didn't feel so hard anymore. It felt right. Sara didn't say anything at first. She just stared at me, blinking, as though she was waiting for me to take it back, to apologize, to somehow make it all go away. But there was no going back. Not this time. Well, if that's how you feel, she said, standing up slowly, a small, condescending smile forming on her lips. Then fine. Go ahead. But don't come crawling back when you realize I was right. Her words stung, but it didn't matter anymore. I had heard enough. The relationship we had was over. There was no fixing it. No going back. You'll regret this, she added, her voice colder than ever. Trust me. But I didn't. And I never would. The next morning, the silence between Sara and me hung in the air like a thick fog. I could feel it the moment I woke up. She was still here, still on the couch, still acting as though nothing had changed. I had barely slept, my mind replaying everything from the night before. The hurtful words, the disbelief, the way she dismissed everything I held dear. I had spent hours turning it over in my head, trying to make sense of it all, but there was nothing to fix. Sara had expected me to cool down, to come to my senses, to apologize for overreacting. That's how it always went. She was so used to people letting her walk all over them, so sure that she could smooth things over with a simple shrug or a smile. But this time, something inside me had shifted. I watched her as she stretched out on the couch, her phone in hand, scrolling mindlessly through messages, her face blank. She hadn't even bothered to talk to me this morning, not that I had expected anything different. She glanced up as she noticed me standing in the doorway. You awake? She asked casually, like nothing had happened. I didn't respond immediately. I just looked at her, really looked at her. The woman I had once thought I loved now seemed like a stranger. I could see it now clearly. Her indifference, her selfishness, it had all been there all along, buried under the surface. But I had ignored it. I had wanted to believe that she could change, that she would eventually understand what truly mattered. But she didn't. You think I'm going to forgive you, don't you? I said finally, my voice calm but with an edge that I knew she could hear. You think this is just going to blow over, like it always does? She sat up slowly, giving me a confused look. What are you talking about, Ethan? You're overreacting. It's just one argument. We've been through worse. I shook my head, the weight of the realization settling heavily on me. No, Sara. This isn't just one argument. This is who you are. Her eyes narrowed, her tone sharp. What's that supposed to mean? I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. It means that I can't be with someone who thinks like this. Someone who sees family as an inconvenience. Someone who can't understand why I would fight for my sister, even when there's no guarantee. Her face hardened, but she didn't say anything. She just crossed her arms, clearly frustrated. So what? You're just gonna walk away from everything we've had? From me? I looked at her, feeling a strange sense of clarity wash over me. Yes, I'm walking away. I can't be with someone who doesn't understand what family means. I won't apologize for that. I could see the gears turning in her head as she processed my words. Then, as if on cue, she let out a sarcastic laugh. You're really doing this, aren't you? You're going to throw away everything because of some delusion about what's right and wronged. She stood up, walking over to me. You'll regret this, you know? Her words stung, but there was no hesitation in my chest. No, I won't. You're the one who's wrong, Sara. You've always been wrong. She took a step back, as though my words had physically struck her. For the first time, I saw something like disbelief in her eyes, but I didn't care. I wasn't looking for her approval anymore. Sara turned and walked toward the door, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Fine, she snapped, voice laced with venom. You'll come crawling back. I know you will. You always do. I stood my ground, the finality in my words ringing in the air. Not this time, and don't bother coming back. It's over. She slammed the door behind her, and I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. It was over. For the first time in years, I felt free. Couldn't save her, but I had saved myself, and I wasn't going to let anyone, especially her, take that away from me. The next morning, the silence in the apartment felt heavier than it ever had before. I kept replaying the events of last night in my head. Sara's cold detachment, the way she belittled everything I held dear, and finally, the moment when I told her it was over. It should have felt like a relief, but instead, It was a quiet storm brewing inside me. I could still hear her voice, her condescending words echoing in my mind, making it impossible to shake off the anger and hurt. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the floor, when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made my heart skip a beat. Emily. I hadn't heard from her since she left the dinner last night. I quickly unlocked my phone, expecting a simple message checking in, something to ease the weight of the day. But what I saw made my stomach twist. It was a series of screenshots, texts from Sara to Emily. At first, I couldn't believe what I was reading. Sara had taken her crusade even further, after I had already told her it was over. She wasn't just dismissing the treatment. She was now targeting Emily directly, trying to tear her down even more. I could barely comprehend the words on the screen, each one colder and more heartless than the last. I hope you understand that I was just trying to save Patrick from wasting his life. One of the messages read, "It's selfish for you to let your family spend so much money on your treatment when they could be saving it for something that matters. You're just holding them back." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do with myself. The sting of betrayal was sharper than anything I had ever felt before. The fact that Sara, after everything we'd been through, could direct such cruelty toward my sister, it was beyond comprehension. My hands were shaking as I read the messages again, the words not quite sinking in at first. The level of heartlessness it took to call my sister selfish for fighting to stay alive was incomprehensible. Emily was already battling a disease that was slowly taking her away from us, and yet Sara was telling her that she was a burden? It felt like a gut punch I wasn't sure I'd ever recover from. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me again, but this time it wasn't just anger toward Sara. It was toward myself for ever thinking I could make things work with someone who lacked the basic decency to see how much my family meant to me. I stared at the phone screen for what felt like forever, my chest tight with grief and fury. How could I have been so blind? I had spent years with her, thinking she was the one, only to find out she had no real understanding of what family truly meant. She had no empathy, no care for the people who mattered most to me. I could feel my heart breaking all over again, not just for Emily, but for the version of myself that had been foolish enough to trust someone like Sara. It wasn't just the words that cut deep. It was the realization that Sara had been willing to do this all along, and I had never noticed. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this apartment, with all the memories of what I had hoped for, with her still looming over me in every corner. I grabbed my coat and headed out, leaving my phone behind. As I walked to Emily's house, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I knew I needed to talk to her. I needed to apologize for what had happened last night, for not being there when she needed me most. But deep down, I also knew that I couldn't go back to the person I was before. I couldn't go back to someone who had let herself be manipulated by someone like Sara. When I reached Emily's door, I knocked softly, trying to quiet the storm raging inside me. She opened it a moment later, her tired eyes lighting up when she saw me. But the warmth I had expected wasn't there. It was replaced by something else, something distant. "Hey!" I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry about last night. You shouldn't have had to deal with that. You shouldn't have to deal with any of this." Emily gave a small, sad smile, her eyes briefly flickering to the floor. "It's not your fault, Ethan. You didn't know." I shook my head, my heart breaking even more. "No, I should have known. I should have seen it. I'm so sorry, Em." She reached out and touched my arm, her grip soft but firm. "It's okay. I know you're here for me. That's what matters." But deep down, I knew that I couldn't undo what had been done. I couldn't unhear Sara's words, and I couldn't erase the damage she had caused. "You know," I said, swallowing hard, "I thought I could make it work with her. But after everything, after what she said to you, I don't know how I could ever look at her the same way again." Emily squeezed my arm and nodded. "You don't need her, Ethan. You don't need someone like that in your life." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift just a little. The world around me didn't feel as heavy as it had moments ago. Sara was gone now, but the scars she'd left would take time to heal. I wasn't sure if I would ever fully understand how someone could be so cold, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never let someone like her tear my family apart again. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. I would never compromise on my values again. Not for anyone. Not ever. As Sara slammed the door behind her, the sound reverberated through the apartment like a final punctuation mark. The moment she left, I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no weight on my chest. No lingering doubt or fear, just silence, and a strange, unexpected sense of freedom. It was a kind of freedom I hadn't known in months. I wasn't shackled anymore by a toxic relationship, by the constant worry of whether things would improve, or if I was making a mistake by staying. I wasn't carrying the heavy burden of pretending to be someone I wasn't, or convincing myself that the person I loved would ever understand the depth of my values. No more pretending. No more compromising. I felt an odd peace, the kind that only comes after letting go of something that was never right for you in the first place. It was as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, and I could finally breathe again. I could finally breathe without wondering if I was making the wrong choice, or if I was being too sensitive. I had made the right decision. For me, for Emily, for my family. As I sank into the couch, the reality of everything that had just happened began to settle in. I thought about Emily and how much I had taken for granted. How her smile, her laughter, her presence had been a constant source of strength for me, even when the world felt like it was falling apart. And I thought about Sara, how she had once seemed like everything I wanted, but now felt like nothing more than a chapter in my life I needed to close. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I had been trying to make a relationship work with someone who didn't understand the one thing that mattered most to me. Family, loyalty, empathy. And Sara had shown me, in the harshest way possible, that she could never comprehend those things. She couldn't see past her own narrow view of the world. She couldn't see that love wasn't about convenience. It was about sacrifice. It was about standing by someone when it wasn't easy, when it wasn't comfortable. And now, with Sara gone, I was free to focus on what truly mattered, Emily and the rest of my family. The people who had never let me down, who had always been there through thick and thin. I would be there for Emily every step of the way, no matter how much time we had left. I would show up for her in every way I could, because I knew now, more than ever, that family was everything. I leaned back and closed my eyes, reflecting on the journey I had just gone through. The pain, the confusion, the realization that sometimes, even when you love someone, you have to walk away. But in doing so, you give yourself the chance to be true to who you really are. To protect the ones who matter most, even if it means giving up something you thought you wanted. I smiled softly to myself. I'm not wasting my life, I whispered under my breath, as if the words were a declaration to the universe. I'm living it. Every moment with my sister, my family, the people who matter. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. I felt at peace knowing I had made the right choice.